Mariana Vasconcelos was never the kind of woman who was easily intimidated. She grew up in a simple but close-knit family, where she learned early on that respect was something earned, not imposed. So when she married Eduardo, she knew that dealing with his mother, Helena, would be a challenge. The woman was cold, refined, and had an assessing gaze that seemed to find flaws no one else could see. From their very first meeting, Helena made it clear that she considered Mariana unfit for her son. She never had to say it outright, her rehearsed smiles and subtle remarks carried the message. Over time, Mariana learned to ignore the provocations and maintain her composure, but the tension was always there, hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. On the night of her 30th birthday, however, Helena did something unexpected. The party was lively, friends and family scattered throughout the hall, when her mother-in-law arrived with a gift that made everyone hold their breath, a luxury SUV, parked right at the entrance, with a massive red bow on the hood. The murmurs started instantly. Mariana felt a chill run down her spine at the sight. It didn't make sense. Never, in all those years, had Helena shown such generosity. Eduardo, on the other hand, was ecstatic. He hugged his mother enthusiastically, seeing the gift as a sign of truce. "See, love? My mom likes you," he said, squeezing Mariana's hand. She smiled, but something inside her screamed that this wasn't a gift. It was a move, a game. And she still didn't know what the stakes were. As the applause died down, Mariana approached the car with hesitant steps, her fingers grazing the polished hood. The scent of new leather filled the air, yet something about it felt off. Helena stood beside her, watching with a knowing smirk, her manicured nails tapping lightly against her clutch. "I thought it was time you had something more fitting," she said, her voice dripping with feigned warmth. Mariana forced a smile, aware of the dozens of eyes on her. "It's very generous of you," she replied, choosing her words carefully. Eduardo, oblivious to the tension, beamed with pride. "Go on, love. Get in, see how it feels." But as Mariana opened the driver's side door and slid in, a faint shiver ran down her spine. The steering wheel was cold, unnervingly so. That night, after the guests had left and the house had finally settled into silence, Mariana lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Eduardo was fast asleep. Beside her, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing in her mind. She couldn't shake the unease creeping into her chest. Why would Helena, who had spent years subtly undermining her, suddenly shower her with a lavish gift? The woman never acted without a motive. Turning onto her side, Mariana stared at the car through the window, parked neatly in their driveway, the streetlight casting eerie reflections on its windshield. It sat there, pristine, waiting. And for reasons she couldn't yet explain. She felt like it was watching her. Days passed, and Mariana found herself avoiding the car. Eduardo, eager for her to embrace the gift, kept suggesting they take it for a drive, but she always found an excuse. "I've been using the other car for so long, I'm just used to it," she'd say, or "maybe this weekend, when I have more time." But the truth was, every time she walked past it, she felt a strange discomfort creeping up her spine. It wasn't just suspicion anymore, it was something deeper, an instinctual warning she couldn't ignore. Even inside the house, she found herself glancing out the window, half expecting the car to somehow change, to reveal what it was hiding. One afternoon, when Eduardo was at work, Mariana finally gave in. She grabbed the keys, inhaled sharply, and slid into the driver's seat. The leather was stiff, the air inside oddly stale for a brand new vehicle. As she turned on the engine, a subtle but unsettling vibration coursed through the car, as if something beneath the hood wasn't quite right. She frowned. That didn't seem normal. But it wasn't until she started adjusting the settings that the real alarm bells rang. The multimedia system lit up with a profile already configured, Helena. Confused, she clicked through the options, expecting some kind of default setup. Instead, she found something far worse, a tracking system actively pinging her location. The destination history was blank, but the GPS logs showed that the car was still linked to an external device. Someone had been monitoring it. And she had a sickening feeling she knew exactly who. Mariana's fingers hovered over the screen, her pulse quickening. She navigated further into the settings, her breath catching as she found another function buried within the system, an active audio recording feature. A cold sweat broke out on her skin. Every conversation inside this car could be monitored. Every word spoken, every private thought shared. And Helena had access to it all. She swallowed hard, her mind racing. Was this just another way for her mother-in-law to exert control? Or was there something even more sinister at play? The thought of Helena listening in, knowing every route Mariana took, sent a shudder down her spine. It wasn't paranoia. It was real. Her first instinct was to rip the system apart, to destroy whatever device was enabling this twisted surveillance. But she forced herself to think rationally. If she confronted Eduardo now, he'd likely dismiss it as a misunderstanding, another example of her reading too much into things. No, she needed proof. Real, undeniable proof. Her hands trembled as she pulled out her phone, snapping screenshots of the tracking data, the registered email linked to Helena, the active audio logs. Every piece of evidence she could gather. Then, gripping the steering wheel tightly, she whispered to herself, she's not going to win. Determined to uncover more, Mariana decided to take the car to someone she could trust. She called Ricardo, an old friend of her brother's who worked as a mechanic. He owed her a favor, and this wasn't something she wanted to take to just anyone. When she arrived at his garage, she kept her explanations vague at first. Something feels off with this car, she said, handing him the keys. Ricardo raised an eyebrow but nodded. I'll take a look. As he popped the hood and started his inspection, Mariana watched anxiously, her stomach twisting into knots. Minutes passed, and then she saw it, the way his expression darkened, the way his brows furrowed in concern. This isn't a brand new engine, he finally muttered, stepping back and wiping his hands on a rag. Who told you this car was new? Mariana felt her heart drop. Helena. It was a gift from my mother-in-law. Ricardo exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Well, either she got scammed, or she knew exactly what she was doing. He pointed at a section near the engine block, where bolts had been tampered with. This car has been in a serious accident. The entire front was rebuilt, poorly, I might add. You're lucky nothing's gone wrong yet, but if you push this thing too hard, it could fail on you at the worst possible moment. Mariana's hands clenched into fists. It was no accident that Helena had given her this car. The tracking, the recording, and now this? It wasn't just about control anymore. This was something far more dangerous. Mariana gripped the edge of the workbench in Ricardo's garage, her knuckles turning white. The weight of realization pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. Helena hadn't just given her a car, she had handed her a ticking time bomb. And Eduardo? He would never believe it. He always found a way to justify his mother's behavior, always insisted she meant well, even when her words cut like knives. But how could he explain this? How could anyone look at this and see anything other than a calculated attempt to put Mariana in danger? The thought sent a violent shiver through her body. She snapped out of it when Ricardo placed a hand on her shoulder. Listen, he said, his voice low and serious. You can't keep driving this thing. One long trip, one wrong turn, and you could end up stranded, or worse. Mariana nodded, her throat dry. She knew he was right. But this wasn't just about the car anymore. It was about proving what she had long suspected. Helena wasn't just manipulative. She was dangerous. I need everything, Mariana said, straightening her spine. Photos, reports, whatever proves this car isn't safe. Ricardo nodded and got to work. Mariana pulled out her phone, scrolling through her messages. She had everything she needed to confront Eduardo. The only question was, would he finally see the truth? That evening, Mariana sat at the kitchen table, her laptop open in front of her, every piece of evidence lined up like a case file. Screenshots of the tracking system, the audio logs, photos of the tampered engine, proof that couldn't be ignored. Eduardo arrived home minutes later, smiling as he loosened his tie. Hey, babe, he greeted, leaning down to kiss her. But she didn't return the gesture. Instead, she turned the laptop toward him. We need to talk. Eduardo's expression shifted from warmth to confusion as he took a seat. What's this? He asked, scrolling through the images. His forehead creased. Mariana, what am I looking at? She inhaled sharply, keeping her voice steady. Your mother's gift? It's a setup. The car isn't new, Eduardo. It was in an accident. The engine was barely put back together. And that's not even the worst part. She clicked on the tracking log. Helena's been monitoring everywhere I go, listening to everything I say in that car. This wasn't a present, it was a trap. Eduardo let out a dry laugh, shaking his head as if trying to dismiss the weight of what he was seeing. Come on, Mariana. You really think my mother would go this far? Maybe she was tracking it for safety reasons. And the engine, maybe she didn't know. His voice carried that familiar, desperate hope, the same one he always clung to whenever Helena crossed the line. But Mariana had no patience for denial. She leaned forward, her eyes burning into his. She knew. Eduardo, she knew. This wasn't about safety. This was about control. And if the car malfunctioned while I was driving? If something happened to me? Do you think she'd even pretend to care? The words hung in the air like a thick fog, suffocating the room. Eduardo's jaw tightened, his gaze darting between the photos, the tracking logs, and his wife's unwavering stare. A part of him still wanted to believe there was some logical explanation. But deep down, in a place he rarely allowed himself to visit, he knew. He had always known what his mother was capable of. He had just never been forced to confront it this directly. His fingers ran through his hair as he exhaled sharply. I need to talk to her, he muttered, but Mariana slammed the laptop. Shut. No. You need to listen to me first. Eduardo's face was a storm of emotions, confusion, disbelief, anger, but Mariana refused to back down. She's been trying to push me out of your life since day one. But this is different, Eduardo. This wasn't just manipulation. It was a warning. She wanted to remind me that I don't belong, that she's always one step ahead. Her voice cracked, but she steadied herself. And if I hadn't checked? If I had just driven that car like she expected me to? The implication hung heavy between them. Eduardo pushed back from the table, pacing across the kitchen. He opened his mouth, then closed it, rubbing a hand over his face as if trying to scrub away the truth. This is insane, he finally muttered. I know my mother is difficult, but this? You're asking me to believe she'd actually put you in danger. His words lacked conviction. Mariana saw the war inside him, the part of him that wanted to defend his mother, clashing against the part that knew, deep down, that she was right. She let the silence stretch, waiting for him to catch up to the truth she had already accepted. When Eduardo finally spoke again, his voice was quieter, stripped of its usual certainty. I need to hear it from her, he said, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Mariana wanted to scream. What more proof did he need? But she knew Eduardo too well. He needed to confront Helena himself, to look her in the eyes and see what she had to say. Fine, she said, grabbing her phone and dialing the number before he could second-guess himself. The line rang twice before Helena's voice came through, smooth and composed as ever. Eduardo, dear. What a surprise. Mariana pressed the speaker button without hesitation. We need to talk, May, Eduardo said, his voice tight. About the car. There was the briefest pause. Barely a second, but Mariana caught it. Oh. Helena's tone remained perfectly measured, but there was an unmistakable shift, a subtle calculation at play. Is something wrong with it? Eduardo swallowed hard. You tell me. You gave Mariana a car with a rebuilt engine, a tracking system linked to your email, and audio surveillance. So tell me, what exactly was the gift, May? The silence that followed was deafening. And when Helena finally spoke, her voice was coated in something that sent a chill down Mariana's spine. Amusement. Oh, Eduardo, she said with a soft chuckle. You always were so naive. Mariana felt her breath hitch. Eduardo stiffened beside her, his fingers gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles turned white. What the hell does that mean? He demanded, his voice louder now, filled with something Mariana had rarely heard when he spoke to his mother, rage. But Helena remained unfazed. It means, May Ophelio, that I have always done what's best for you. And you've never been able to see it. Her voice was maddeningly calm, like she was explaining something simple to a child. Mariana was never meant to last. She doesn't belong in this family. You think I'd just stand by and let her take you away from us? Mariana's stomach twisted. The confirmation hit harder than she expected. She had spent years trying to convince herself that Helena's hostility was just passive aggression, a bitter resentment that would never truly cross the line. But now, there it was, spoken so plainly, so coldly. So what? Eduardo snapped. You were hoping the car would kill her? That I'd just come running back home, grieving and broken? He let out a bitter laugh, but there was no humor in it. What kind of monster are you? For the first time, Helena's voice hardened. I did what needed to be done. Eduardo's breath came out in short, uneven bursts. Mariana could see the moment the last shred of denial broke inside him. His mother, the woman he had spent his whole life defending, excusing, justifying, had just admitted, without an ounce of remorse, that she had deliberately put Mariana in danger. He ran a shaky hand through his hair, his chest rising and falling like he had just been punched. You needed to do this? His voice was barely above a whisper, but the fury in it was palpable. You put my wife's life at risk because you decided she wasn't good enough for me? Helena sighed, as if she were the one exhausted by this conversation. You're overreacting, Eduardo. The car was never meant to kill her. Just remind her where she stands. A little fear can be a powerful thing. Mariana felt her stomach churn. The casual cruelty in those words made her skin crawl. Eduardo let out a dry, hollow laugh, shaking his head as he stared at the phone in disbelief. You're sick, he muttered, voice unsteady. And you think I'd ever forgive this? That I'd ever look at you the same way again? Helena didn't answer right away. And then, with a finality that sent a chill through both of them, she simply said, You'll understand one day, meu amor. Family always comes home. And then the line went dead. The silence that followed was suffocating. Mariana could still hear Helena's voice echoing in her head, those last words dripping with certainty, as if this was just another game to her, one she still expected to win. Eduardo sat motionless, staring at the phone like it had turned into something foreign, something venomous. His entire world had just shifted, the foundation of everything he had believed about his mother crumbling beneath him. Mariana wanted to say something, to pull him out of the trance, but what could she say? I told you so felt cruel. We need to get away from her felt obvious. So instead, she just reached for his hand. Eduardo flinched at the touch, but then his fingers tightened around hers, desperate, like he was holding on to the only thing keeping him grounded. I can't believe this, he muttered, more to himself than to her. She really, his voice broke, and Mariana felt the weight of his grief as if it were her own. No matter how manipulative, how toxic Helena had been, she was still his mother. The betrayal was deeper than just this moment, it was the realization that every red flag, every warning Mariana had given him, had been true. He exhaled shakily. We need to cut her off. He said it like he was still convincing himself, but Mariana knew it was the only choice they had left. We walk away. For good. Mariana nodded, relief washing over her, but it was laced with something heavier. This wasn't just about blocking Helena's number or ignoring her calls. This was severing ties with a woman who had spent decades shaping Eduardo's life, who had always believed he would eventually come back to her, no matter what. And now, he was making the choice to walk away. She's not going to let go easily, Mariana warned, squeezing his hand. You know that, right? Eduardo let out a bitter chuckle, rubbing a hand over his face. Yeah, I know. He looked up at her then, something raw and determined in his eyes. But I also know she's never going to change. And I'm done pretending she will. That night, they took every step to cut Helena out for good. Eduardo sent a final message, short, direct. We're done. Don't contact us again. Then, he blocked her. Mariana did the same. They changed their home security codes, called their bank to ensure Helena had no lingering access to anything tied to their names. Eduardo even called the dealership, arranging to have the car towed away first thing in the morning. I don't want that thing anywhere near us, he muttered, watching through the window as the SUV sat under the streetlight, its glossy surface reflecting the night sky. It was never a gift. It was a warning. Mariana slid her arms around him, resting her head against his shoulder. She doesn't control us, she whispered. Eduardo exhaled, wrapping his arms around her. Not anymore. The next morning, Mariana watched as the tow truck hauled the SUV away, its taillights vanishing down the street like a ghost finally exorcised. She expected to feel relieved, but instead, a strange unease lingered in her chest. Helena was gone from their lives, at least in theory, but Mariana knew women like her didn't just let go. There would be more attempts, messages from unknown numbers, sudden coincidental run-ins, whispers sent through distant relatives. Helena had lost this battle, but in her mind, the war wasn't over. Eduardo, however, seemed lighter. That afternoon, he packed a box with the last remnants of his mother's influence, old gifts, framed photos, things that once held meaning but now felt tainted. "I don't want reminders of her in our home," he admitted, sealing the box shut with a firm press of his hands. Mariana nodded, knowing this was his way of reclaiming control. But as she watched him carry the box to the car, a thought gnawed at the edges of her mind. This wasn't just about cutting ties. This was about unlearning a lifetime of manipulation, of realizing the person who should have protected him had instead tried to break him. And that kind of wound didn't heal overnight. The first few weeks without Helena were eerily quiet. No unexpected calls, no sudden appearances, nothing. It was almost unsettling, like the calm before a storm. Mariana could see the tension still weighing on Eduardo, even as he tried to move forward. He kept his phone close, half expecting a message to slip through, some desperate plea or veiled threat. But none came. One evening, as they sat on the couch in the dim glow of the living room lamp, he finally admitted what had been haunting him. "It's not over," he muttered, staring at the floor. Mariana frowned. "Eduardo, we cut her off. She can't reach us." He shook his head. "That's not what I mean. She's waiting. She's planning her next move." Mariana wanted to tell him he was being paranoid, that Helena had lost and was finally giving up. But deep down, she knew better. Helena wasn't the kind of person to accept defeat. "Then we stay." Ahead of her, Mariana said firmly. "Whatever she tries, we'll be ready." Eduardo sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I just don't want to spend my life looking over my shoulder." She took his hand, squeezing it gently. "Then don't," she whispered. "We're free now, Eduardo. Let's start acting like it." He nodded, though the worry in his eyes didn't fade completely. The damage Helena had done couldn't be undone in a day. But at least now, they were facing it together. Months passed, and life slowly settled into a new rhythm. Eduardo and Mariana focused on their own happiness, building a life without the shadow of Helena looming over them. They traveled, redecorated their home, and for the first time in years, Eduardo didn't feel the weight of his mother's expectations crushing his every decision. But no matter how much distance they put between themselves and Helena, a part of him remained haunted by what she had done. Late at night, he would catch himself checking the locks twice, glancing at his phone as if expecting something to slip through the cracks. Mariana noticed, but never pushed. Healing wasn't linear, and she knew some wounds took longer to close. Then, one evening, as they were finishing dinner, a sharp knock echoed through the house. Eduardo and Mariana exchanged a glance. They weren't expecting anyone. A cold prickle ran down Mariana's spine as she approached the door. Through the peephole, she saw nothing but a small, neatly wrapped box on the doorstep. No one in sight. Her pulse quickened as she hesitated before unlocking the door. Eduardo was already behind her when she finally picked up the package. There was no name, no return address, just a single card taped to the top. Hands shaking, she unfolded it. 3 words, written in elegant, familiar script. "Family always returns." A shiver ran down Mariana's spine as she stared at the words, her fingers tightening around the card. Eduardo stood frozen beside her, his jaw clenched, his breath coming in shallow bursts. He didn't need to ask who had sent it. They both knew. Mariana carefully unwrapped the box, her heart pounding in her chest. Inside, nestled in a bed of white tissue paper, was a single car key. Her stomach twisted violently. It was identical to the one she had returned when they got rid of Helena's so-called gift. A cruel, silent message, Helena wasn't done. Eduardo snatched the key, his hands trembling with fury. "She's still trying to control us," he muttered, his voice laced with disbelief and rage. Mariana exhaled slowly, meeting his gaze. "No," she said firmly. "She's trying to scare us." She took the key from his hands and, without hesitation, tossed it into the fireplace. Flames consumed it instantly, the metal glowing red before disappearing into ash. Eduardo watched, his fists unclenching, his breathing slowing. And then, for the first time since everything began, he smiled, small, tired, but real. "She doesn't own us anymore," he murmured. "Mariana." nodded, lacing her fingers through his. No. She never did. The past might never fully let them go, but they had made their choice. And this time, it was theirs alone.